1944 with Evan Weiner. Evan's been with us multiple times. He is from our area, as I'm sure he'll tell you his origin story up top. But he's a local. We're happy to have him back. He's always a fount of wisdom and knowledge, so I hope you'll enjoy it. I'm going to go turn off the lights.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you for coming here. It's a nice day. It stopped raining and all, so I watered this morning. Why? Anyway, yeah, I am local. I started my career in 1971 in radio and in newspapers at Spring Valley High School when I was in 11th grade. Joe Dionisio student, you have a good voice. How'd you like to be on radio? And I was, in the worst way, on WRKL on Tiger Talk. That's where I started, also with the Journal News and the Bergen Record. And by 1978, I ended up on WNEW radio. Remember WNEW? William B. Williams and all of that. So I actually have some links to 1944, aside from family, which I'm going to talk about. And it's also, I guess it's Israel Independence Day or something like that today. And even though we're not talking about Israel here today per se, well, it's part of 1944. Well, some of the celebrities, or celebrities, right? Some of the important people of 1944. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. The war continues. This is a museum outside of Washington, D.C. in Dulles. It's a part of the Smithsonian. You got to pay 15 bucks to get in there, but it's well worth it. You can see things like the Enola Gay in there, which dropped the atomic bomb in 1945, and of course that's a German plane. There was a Hitler assassination attempt in 1944. This is a banned cartoon. It was very popular in 1944. Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips. You will not see this ever again on TV. I'll get into it a bit later. How many of you benefited in some way from the GI Bill? Whether your father, well, I would say your father, anybody in World War II? And did he go to college? And he didn't, but were you able to get loans to get housing? Where'd you end up living?
Queens.
Queens. And you also benefited?
Yeah, my father went to college with
Went to college. And did you get a house in the suburbs?
We did, but I don't know if it was through the GI Bill.
Oh, okay. Probably. Where did you come from?
Rockland.
Rockland. Okay, Rockland. There was a presidential race that year, Franklin Roosevelt against Thomas Dewey. Stalingrad, 1943, and this is one of the turning points of World War II. Germany's march through Europe started, of course, on September 1st, 1939, and France and Britain declared war on Germany 2 days later, September 3rd. But Germany started to run into major problems in 1943. Soviet Union and a lot of people in the United States don't realize how much heavy lifting the Soviets did during World War II. They lost millions upon millions of men. But they launched a counteroffensive against the Germans at Stalingrad in the middle of November 1942. Eventually, they would encircle the German army. They had more than 220,000 soldiers. In February of 1943, after fierce fighting and heavy casualties, the Germans, 91,000 of them, surrendered. After the victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet army went on the offensive, and they would liberate Ukraine. Right now, they're trying to take Ukraine, right? And virtually all of Russia and Eastern Belarusia during 1943. But the Battle of Stalingrad proved to be a psychological turning point, and that ended the string of German victories in the summer of 1942 and began their long retreat westward.
Stalingrad is what today?
It's what?
Is it still Stalingrad?
No. It's,
what city is it?
was it Minsk now? Is it Minsk? I'm not sure.
St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg is Leningrad. St. Petersburg is Leningrad. And this would set the stage for 1944. This is Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project. In fact, I was giving a talk about 1939 and how Einstein delivered the message to Roosevelt. The Germans might have an atomic bomb. And some guy over in Armonk said, you gotta go down to Mount Kisco. I said, why? He said, it's where they stored all the stuff for the atomic bomb. And they're trying to sell the property. It's a super fun cleanup. And they've been trying to sell the property forever. But anyway, Oppenheimer, Robert Oppenheimer, he is the head of the Manhattan Project. And on January 19, 1942, Roosevelt formally authorizes the atomic bomb project. 1939, he had a uranium committee, and that would graduate to this. And in June of 1942, the U.S. Army establishes this Manhattan Project, and this is to handle the atomic bomb project. And they began to transfer responsibility from the Office of Scientific Research and Development to the military. In September, Lieutenant Governor General Leslie Richard Groves Jr. was appointed in 1942 what would become the Manhattan Project, and he would select J. Robert Oppenheimer to head the project's secret weapons laboratory. 1943, scientists were really concerned that 1939 announcement that the Germans had figured out about fission would come to be, and the Germans would have an atomic bomb. I don't know if you know who Moe Berg is. Moe Berg was a former Major League catcher who ended up with the OSS, and he went to Germany to find out about whether or not they had the bomb, and he concluded, no, they didn't. But in a letter dated May 25th, 1943, Oppenheimer responded to a proposal from the physicist Enrico Fermi to use radioactive materials to poison German food supplies. And here is Fermi. Oppenheimer asked Fermi, can you produce enough strontium without letting too many in on the secret? Because he said, I think we should not attempt a plan unless we can poison food sufficient to kill 500,000 men. That's what they were thinking. And as Groves, that is Oppenheimer. In July, he abandoned the gun design in favor of an implosion-type weapon using chemical explosive lenses as some critical sphere of fissile material that could be squeezed into a smaller, dense form. The metal needed to travel only short distances, so critical mass would be assembled in much less time. In August, he implemented sweeping reorganization of the Los Alamos, New Mexico laboratory to focus on the implosion. He concentrated on the development efforts on the gun-type device, again, a simpler design that only had to work with uranium-235 in a single group, and this device would become Little Boy in February 1945, and Little Boy is aboard the Enola Gay in August of 1945. The siege of Leningrad ends. One of the cool things about going to Leningrad for me was going to the Winter Palace and finding out that during the war, everything in the Winter Palace was buried underground so the Nazis couldn't loot it and take it home with them because the city was under siege. The siege lasted about 900 days between September 8, 1941 and January 27. 872 days, but who's counting? In January, a successful Soviet offensive drove the Germans westward from the city's outskirts, ending the siege. Soviets were making huge strides against the Nazis at that point and would eventually go into Berlin. Anybody here whose fathers, maybe uncles, cousins, part of the D-Day invasion in Normandy? Anybody? Well, I used to speak at Yogi Berra's museum. Remember Yogi Berra, right? Ain't over until it's over. Well, in 1944, on D-Day, Yogi Berra hit the beach as part of the Navy in Normandy. And normally, by the way, how many of you had relatives who served in World War II? Okay, did they ever talk about it? No, Mom was the word. Mom was the word. So I kind of hesitated asking Yogi about what he did when he hit the beach. But I did say this to Yogi. I said, you scared? He said, no. I said, why not? He says, Well, the bullets go high and I'm short. Yogiism. But anyway, this is outside of, this is in northern France, and I went to one of the museums there, and that's one of the bombs, or at least, you know, a replica of a bomb. It was called Operation Overlord, or D-Day. And about 155,000 Allied troops hit the beaches of Normandy in France. The efforts to free France from Nazi occupation began in June with D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, when the Allied troops land on the beaches and start making their way to Paris. Now, the beginnings of the D-Day plan started in Quebec City in 1943 when Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill. There were a couple of Quebec City conferences and some leftovers from D-Day. More Allied troops would hit southern France on August 15th, and they would make their way to the Rhine River. As the Allies pushed into Paris, French resistance fighters began an uprising in Paris. By August 25th, the Allies and Free French forces entered Paris, and by the end of the month, the French government is handed to the Free French troops and Charles de Gaulle. Operation Bagration. This was started on the night of June 21st, or the early morning hours of June 22nd, and the Soviets launched yet another summer offensive in Belarus, 3 years to the day after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Germans had achieved total surprise. They were able to encircle millions of Russian troops, and their intentions was to go to Moscow and into Leningrad. This was named after a Tsarist marshal who fought Napoleon and hits the German with no warning. Within 5 weeks, the Red Army advanced 450 miles, driving through Minsk and to the outskirts of Warsaw. Nearly 20 German divisions were destroyed, another 50 severely mauled. It was a worse disaster than Stalingrad. I had a guy the other day, I was doing a talk about 1939. He was a survivor. And he was complaining about my 1939 talk. See, he didn't talk about the Holocaust. It was in conjunction with Holocaust Remembrance Day. I said, no, I'm talking about 1939. There were no concentration camps in 1939, to which the guy agreed, because he was a concentration camp survivor. It wasn't until 1944 that the outside world knew about concentration camps like Majdanek. It was the first camp to be liberated near Lublin, Poland in July. Lublin is where my relatives lived. My grandfather, his brother, and his sister all left around 1908, somewhere around there, and everybody stayed. And I remember as a kid, we used to go to Manhattan, and it was on 14th Street, and my grandfather would search names looking for survivors. He never found them. Surprised by the rapid Soviet advance from the east, the Germans attempted to hide evidence of mass murder by demolishing much of the camp. But parts remained, such as the gas chamber. Anne Frank was arrested. She's a teenage girl. She was arrested in 1944. It's August the 4th, and acting on the tip from an informant, the Nazi Gestapo captured 15-year-old Anne Frank and her family in a sealed-off area in an Amsterdam warehouse. The Franks had taken shelter there since 1942 because they feared they would be deported to a Nazi concentration camp. Outside world knew about 1944, but obviously this was going on. So she spent much of her time in a secret annex working on her diary, which was called the Secret Annex. Well, they tried to get Hitler in 1939. Didn't do it. They missed him by 12 minutes. That was George Elser, and that may or may not have been a legitimate assassination attempt in 1939. This one wasn't a legitimate assassination attempt. July 20, Adolf Hitler survives an assassination attempt A German officer by the name of Klaus von Stauffenberg. High-ranking German officials said, hey, look, we're losing the war. This is awful. Hitler must die. He was leading the Germans, in their mind, on a suicidal mission. He has wars on two fronts, and the only way to stop him is to kill him. Coup d'etat, excuse me?
It should start with Putin, with Putin.
And Putin right now? I don't know what's going on with Putin right now.
Yeah, they should do it with him.
Yeah, well, oh, they should do it with him, okay. Anyway, there would be a coup d'etat, and there would be a new government in Berlin, and that would save Germany from the complete destruction from the Allies. And here is Klaus von Stauffenberg. It's 12:42 in the afternoon. The bomb goes up. When the smoke cleared, Hitler was wounded, charred, and suffered temporary paralysis in one arm, but he was still alive. 4 others present died of their wounds. In 1939, he was giving a speech. It was the 16th anniversary of the Bierwald Push, and the place exploded 12 minutes after he had left. This one, they got closer to him. They caught von Stauffenberg, and he was shot the same day. Once Hitler figured out the extent of the conspiracy, he began systematic liquidation of his enemies. 7,000 Germans would be arrested, 5,000 ended up dead, either executed or suicides. I talked about Quebec City. Quebec City plays a major role in the D-Day operation. The first Quebec conference was held in August 1943 with Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, William Lyon Mackenzie, Prime Minister of Canada, and one of the Soongs, TV Soong, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for what is mainland China. These would be the people who fled to Taiwan in 1949. And they basically were talking about, well, we got to invade Italy, and we got to invade France. And there they are, Quebec City. There's the Frontenac Hotel, and that scene looks exactly the same today. Nothing has changed. Frontenac is still there, Plains of Abraham is still here, and they're sitting in front of the Plains of Abraham. The second Quebec conference takes place in September 1942, Roosevelt and Churchill. And the decisions made there to advance against Germany on 2 Western fronts. Additionally, there was a revised timetable to invade the Philippines, resulting in the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October and the struggle for Okinawa in the spring of 1945. Does the name Wernher von Braun mean anything to you?
Sure.
Sure, what is it?
An astrophysicist who developed rockets and the precursor to our rocket launching and
But for what country?
well, initially for
Germany.
and then for us.
Okay. That's the V2 rocket. And, whoa, that's the V2 rocket. I haven't seen one of these since I was a kid, by the way. And that's Wernher von Braun's brainchild. The American scientist, Robert Goddard of Massachusetts, he started working on jet propulsion and rocketry in the 19-teens. In the 1920s, he anticipated what would become the German V2. Gyroscopic control, steering by means of vanes in the jet stream of the rocket motor, a gimbal steering, power-driven fuel pumps, and other devices. And about 5 years ago, I was giving a talk on the space program. And a guy was telling me he was in World War II. And he said he was in England. And he said they were scared to death of this rocket because they had never seen anything like this before. And if the Germans were able to develop more of these, and if they were reliable, the war would have continued. It was launched mobily. Each V2 rocket was 46 feet high, carried a ton of explosives. The first attack on London, September 8th, 1944, and gouged a 32-foot freighter, killed 3, injured 22. And by the way, if you are in London, you can still see the remnants of the Blitzkrieg in this. This is what it looked like after the cleanup. It took just 5 minutes from launch to landing. It stood for Vergeltungswaffen, or retaliatory weapon, and it was the last-ditch effort by the Germans to reverse the course of the war. Who made these? What was the concentration camp survivors? Well, slaves. I don't know. Can you call a concentration camp survive? Well, the people in the concentration slaves.
They weren't in the camps.
They were in the camps. They were taken out of the camps. They were taken out of the camps.
Slave labor.
They were prisoners, and they were pulled from the concentration camps because they had technical skills. Because the Germans kept detailed records about what these people did. They knew how to weld, and they worked at an underground factory called Mittenwald near the Buchenwald concentration camp in central Germany. Now, these people were living under appalling conditions before they got into the factory, so I'm not sure appalling conditions actually apply here. Well, there was hardly any daylight, they had little sleep, there was no proper sanitation, but they figured out a way to kind of sabotage the weaponry. Many were executed for attempted sabotage. Eyewitness accounts describe prisoners hanging from cranes above the rocket assembly lines. Sabotage? How do you sabotage if you have no means to sabotage? Urinate on the parts. That's what they did. They urinated on the parts and kind of ruined the parts. The guy, where is he? Right here. Second from the right. Right there. Wernher von Braun. Very complicated. Very, very complicated story about Wernher von Braun. He came from a political family. He also had some money. And he joined the Nazi Party on November 12, 1937. But he said he was coerced by the SS. It's been documented that he didn't want his research used for military purposes. He even said he was coerced into joining the Nazi Party. But there he is with Himmler. He's the guy without the suit back there. So was he coerced or was he part of all of this? I'm going to tell you something in a minute because of a guy I know by the name of Dick Hall, but let me get to that after this. The engineer, he's the one who designed the V2, Wernher von Braun. And the Allies realized that this thing was a machine that they had never seen before or never experienced before or couldn't develop themselves. Now, as far as von Braun, my friend Dick Hall, now living in Cape Kennedy area, joined NASA around 1960. And he said, I don't know if you know anything about Operation Paperclip. You do? How many of you ever heard of Operation Paperclip? Operation Paperclip was after the war. The United States brought 1,600 Nazis to the United States to work on the defense program and ultimately the space program. They were initially sent to Texas and then to Alabama. Dick Hall worked with them, and he said they never changed their stripes. They would never learn English. They would talk to each other so you wouldn't know what they were talking about, and Dick never trusted them. Dick was part of the Mercury program, the Gemini program, and the Apollo program, and he left in about 1975 to move elsewhere. Anybody here ever hear of Oswego?
Oswego, New York?
Oswego, no, I'm talking, yes, Oswego, New York. About the play or movie Oswego. Anybody ever hear of that? Okay, this is my tangential, I'm affected by this tangentially because I was part of a group looking for a 99-seat theater to try out a play called Oswego in the United States. We never got the 99-seat theater, but I'll tell you more about that in a couple of minutes. Jewish refugees finally welcomed into the United States. Where were they sent? Oswego. What place can you send them that's any worse in the winter than Oswego? That's where they ended up. On August 5th, 1944, buses holding about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees from Europe pulled up to the entrance of Oswego's Fort Ontario, military site since the Revolutionary War. They were chosen from 3,000 applicants throughout Italy who had heard of the U.S. rescue through the work of Ruth Gruber. Anybody here ever hear of Ruthie Gruber? You have. Photojournalist who also somehow ended up with the Roosevelt administration in terms of basically lobbying to get Jews into the United States. She was sent to Italy as a representative of the newly established War Refugee Board. And she escorted a group of refugees to the United States. It's Ruth Gruber. She lived in Riverdale. My friends knew her. I didn't ever get a chance to meet her. But my friend Bill Goldstein was good friends with her. Bill Goldstein decided with my friend Bob Block to write a play about Ruth Gruber and her role in bringing these Jews to the United States. And my job was get a 99-seat theater, and we never could. We never could. But anyway, they landed in New York, and she accompanied the families aboard the train to Oswego. After the war, it was Gruber who once again advocated for the residents to be allowed U.S. citizenship, giving them an opportunity to stay in the country if they desired. Well, basically what happened was, we'll take them in temporarily and we'll send them back. None of them went back. A couple of them went on to be a major part of Mad Magazine. A number of them went on to be physicians and lawyers and all that other stuff. Bill and Bob renamed the play that they were doing Haven. It ended up being called Haven, and I think Stephanie Block was supposed to play Ruth Gruber. Anyway, because of her efforts and power of persuasion, Safe Haven was the only shelter in the United States for Jewish refugees during World War II. And a lot of those people led very successful lives in the United States. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the battle for Leyte Gulf. And again, here's Enola Gay, and here are kamikaze planes. I guess they were failures, right? If they have the plane, the kamikazes must have been failures, right? Because they're supposed to kill themselves. But if they, it must have been a bad kamikaze pilot that they were able to get those planes. Anyway, this takes place in October, the main battle between October 23rd and 26th, one of the largest naval battles in world history. United States, Australian, and Filipino forces began the invasion of the Japanese-occupied Philippines, landing in the Leyte Gulf. The Japanese suffered heavy losses to their navy, and the kamikazes went out. The Allies won the battle, and their victory would lead to the liberation of the Philippines. And this is a turning point in the war against Japan. It cuts them off supply routes in Southeast Asia, devastated the naval forces with many of their ships destroyed and a lot killed. Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge. Anybody have anybody who fought in the Battle of the Bulge?
No, the Philippines.
Yeah.
The people were for Germany, were for Hitler, or the people were...
They were American citizens
In the Philippines.
in the Philippines. It was American territory, remember?
Yeah.
They were American
That's what I thought,
citizens.
but they were
Yeah.
for the war.
Yeah. The Battle of the Bulge in Belgium was Adolf Hitler's last offense in World War II. It was against the Western Front, and Hitler had an aim. Let's split the Allies in their drive to Germany. And the German troops' failure to divide Britain, France, and Americans paved the way for the Americans and the Allies to win in Eastern Europe. It was a brutal war, battle rather, lasted December 16th, 1944 to January 25th, 1945. It's the beginning of the end of Germany. But initially, the Germans did well. They caught the Allies by surprise. And there is General Anthony McAuliffe. And the Germans said, surrender.
Nuts.
Nuts. Nuts. That's all. 4 letters, nuts. We're going to go on. He refused to surrender. He was the head of the 101st Airborne Division. The other thing that I am tangentially involved with is this, the Leopoldville. Anybody ever hear of the Leopoldville? It sunk Christmas Eve, 1944. Nobody? Let me tell you the story about how my kids and my grandkids may not be here today if it wasn't for the Leopoldville, because my mother-in-law was married to a guy by the name of George Kessler. And George Kessler was on the ship that sunk on Christmas Eve, 1944. Anybody who was involved with this was held to secrecy, particularly in Britain. Don't snitch or you may lose benefits. Don't snitch. It's Christmas Eve, 1944. Belgian troop ship Leopoldville left the pier at Southampton. About 2,000 American soldiers, including George Kessler, is on there. And they were assigned to the 66th Infantry Division, which crossed the English Channel to France. About 5.5 miles from its destination, Cherbourg, and I'm going to show you a picture today of Cherbourg in a second, the Leopold was torpedoed and sunk by the German submarine, the U-486, 486. 763 American soldiers, including George Kessler, were killed. The bodies of 493 of them, including George Kessler, were never recovered from the channel's frigid 48-degree temperatures. What exactly happened was covered up for decades. Decades. My mother-in-law here. My mother-in-law there is 23 years old. A child on the way. It took nearly an hour for the people in Cherbourg to realize the Leopoldville was sinking. The officers had left. They went to party. They were all drunk. There was nobody in command. Several hundred Allied vessels in the harbor might have served as a rescue craft, but all had cold engines. Why would they have cold engines? Hey, it's party time, Christmas Eve, Cherbourg. The ship went there. Oh, yeah? Oh, all right. Well, we're going to celebrate. And that is my wife, whose mother lost her husband, her first husband, in the port of Cherbourg. The Allies were enjoying Christmas Eve, and they failed to mobilize a rescue effort. And the Leopold sank at 20:40, 8:40 in the evening. Belated efforts by ships including the USS PC 1225 rescued some survivors. News of the sinking 5 miles off the French coast was censored. It was decades before many families learned how their sons, or in my sister-in-law's case, father died. British documents about the incident remained classified until 1996. 802 men died, including George Kessler, Blanche Kessler's husband, with a kid on the way. Glenn Miller disappeared. Many of you like Glenn Miller. You know, Glenn Miller was huge at one time. And he was really used. Pennsylvania 65000, right? Okay. Disappeared.
Little brown jug.
Little brown jug. Anybody else? Glenn Miller, he disappeared. Bad manager, Lieutenant Don Haynes was the last man to see Glenn Miller alive on the ground. Without permission from his chain of command, Miller took his manager's place on the December 15th flight from Twinwood Farm Airfield in Paris, France, to arrange for a band's appearance. The plane never reached France. It was never found. But people held off on the news until Christmas Eve, when the Associated Press announced Miller would not be conducting the scheduled BBC broadcast AEF Christmas show the following day. How many of you like John Wayne? Okay. You realize that John Wayne never did anything, right? He never did anything during the war. He was goaded by his director to do something, get involved. Joe DiMaggio was goaded to get involved and would eventually get involved. How many of you ever heard of Jerry Coleman? He used to be a New York Yankees shortstop. He used to be a New York Yankees announcer, and we were friends. We were absolutely friends. And Jerry Coleman told me the story about how he was flying to Korea with Ted Williams during the Korean action, and Ted Williams was a genuine war hero. Genuine. He's a fake war hero. Lieutenant Jerry Coleman told me Ted Williams was everything John Wayne wanted to be in life. And Jerry Coleman was not the only veteran from either World War II or Korea who thought that little of John Wayne. John Wayne was on his way to become a big star thanks to the director John Ford. But Wayne decides, I'm not getting involved in World War II. I'm not going to be like Jimmy Stewart, Paul Newman, or Clark Gable. I'm not going to get involved. His most famous director was John Ford, and that's the John Ford statue that is in Portland, Maine. John Ford was a great director. And he's now a commander in the United States Navy. And he told the Duke this, get involved, get into it. You're growing rich while men are dying. According to the 1998 book by the author Gary Wills, John Wayne's America, The Politics of Celebrity, the actor received a chorus of boos when he walked onto USO stages in Australia and in the Pacific Islands. Who is in there? Veterans. Wayne, in his mid-30s, is not one of those veterans. And even though a lot of people like the Duke, a lot of World War II veterans had no use for the Duke. I'm going up to the Berkshires in a couple of weeks, and I'm taking my granddaughter. And my son said, you better take her to the Dr. Seuss Museum. How many of you know that Dr. Seuss just didn't produce children's books? Private Snafu. Do you know who Private Snafu is? Do you know what SNAFU stands for?
Yes.
Situation Normal All Up. Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, and Frank Capra teamed up for Private Snafu. Director Frank Capra was the chairman of the United States Armed Forces' first motion pictures unit, and he came up with this character, Private Snafu, a bumbling recruit who did everything wrong. And if you really want to enjoy yourself, go watch it. They're 3 minutes long, they're all up on YouTube, they've all been declassified, and they're hilariously funny. Anyway, to the GI audience, SNAFU was a military slang acronym. Situation Normal All Fouled Up, or some version of that. Anyway, this is Theodore Geisel, Dr. Seuss. Don't let them carve those faces on our mountain. And Hitler, of course, and Hirohito. Buy United States saving bonds and stamps. This is the propaganda campaign by Hollywood. They're 4-minute shorts, or less. It's by Dr. Seuss and voiced by Mel Blanc, Bugs Bunny himself, or Daffy Duck. And produced by Warner Brothers, and they were done by Chuck Jones and by Fritz Freleng. And the cartoons were for military use only. They were considered classified. You couldn't see them as basically civilians. This is one of them. Fake news. Fake news in World War II. That's what it was called, fake news. And basically it was the guy would read something, tell something to somebody else. He would misinterpret what he said. He would tell it to somebody else, and they'd play telephone, and the message would be totally snafu'd by the end. They had titles like Gripes, Spies, The Gold Brick, Censored, Private Snafu versus Malaria Mike, and Booby Traps. It was extremely popular with the guys. Episodes addressed soldiers' gripes with a sympathetic ear, while simultaneously stressing the importance discipline plays in the military establishment. There's Daffy Duck. Daffy Duck is going to be enticed by a female duck, I guess. Anyway, and there's Hitler. Starting in 1943, the kids were inundated with propaganda cartoons, which of course were aimed at their parents, but starring, Daffy Duck, who, by the way, celebrated his 86th birthday last week. The Weekly Reporter, weekly, as in week, not weekly, not the thing that you read in school. What was that? The Weekly Reader, right? What's a Weekly Reader? A Warner Brothers cartoon released on March 25th, directed by Chuck Jones, written by Michael Mortiz, music directed by Carl Stalling. The cartoon is a spoof of sacrifices by those made on the home front during World War II. You'll never see this cartoon on TV. Fritz Freleng, Bugs Bunny Nips the Nips. Produced by Warner Brothers. Animation, war propaganda cartoon where Bugs Bunny fights the Imperial Japanese Army and basically every negative stereotype that you could have of the Japanese, the glasses, the buck teeth, the funny way of talking is in that cartoon. And I don't understand why they don't show it and just put up like they've done with Gone with the Wind. You can see Gone with the Wind on what is called Max now, HBO Max. And they put up a disclaimer at the beginning saying that Gone with the Wind is a product of its time, 1939, 1940, and the sentiment was wrong then, it's wrong today. We do the same thing with this cartoon. We're in a war, we're fighting the Japanese. Look at this cartoon in terms of we are fighting the Japanese. Jack King's Donald Duck, a short Commando Duck premieres. Wartime propaganda cartoon produced by the Walt Disney Company. Donald Duck fights Japanese soldiers. Frank Tashlin's wartime propaganda cartoon, Plain Daffy, is released first by Warner Brothers Cartoons, in which Daffy fights a female Nazi spy and fools Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and Hermann Göring. At the end, he just hits Hitler over the head with a mallet. But, there's also cartoons like Gremlin from the Kremlin. Merry Melodies. There were the Merry Melodies cartoons along with Looney Tunes. Russian Rhapsody. Hitler flies a bomber to attack the Soviet Union but is met by gremlins. Gremlins from the Kremlin. About 40 wartime movies were made. The U.S. War Information had a unit, the Office of War Information, had a unit dedicated exclusively to Hollywood, the Bureau of Motion Pictures. I'm going to ask this crowd anyway. How many of you know of Melvin Kaminsky, Mel Brooks? Anybody who doesn't know of him? How many of you know of the producers? Or parts of Blazing Saddles? All he did was lift it from Warner Brothers cartoons. Literally. And in Blazing Saddles, he even has, the music and all that other stuff. But the stuff about Springtime for Hitler, that was done by Warner Brothers in 1944. But there was Axis propaganda, no doubt about that. After the Japanese army assumed control of Santo Tomas Camp in Manila in the Philippines, they had taken carefully staged propaganda photographs of prisoners to show how well they were treated. Prisoners, including children, were made to bow to the officers, beaten if they failed to go low enough. Food and supplies from friends outside the camp cut off. No more meat, just rice and dried fish. And they even had cartoons back in the day on that side. German propaganda supported the efforts of the murderous Nazi regime, even attempting to portray in positive light the horrors of concentration camps. The Fuhrer Gives Cities to Jews was produced a model ghetto established by the Nazis in the former Czechoslovakia. Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels intended the film to prove that Jews were being well treated in camps. Now, I asked before about the GI Bill of Rights, and a couple of you said that it helped you in your lives, or at least helped your family. This is 1944, and the war is coming to an end. These guys know it's just a matter of time before Germany folds, and eventually Japan's going to fold. What do we do with the GIs? what do we do with them when they come home? Well, there's going to be problems with jobs. We have all these women working jobs, right? They're going to want to stay working. But we're going to try to kick them out. But maybe if we do some other things like help the GIs, maybe some women can stay in the workforce. Roosevelt began talking about how veterans would be compensated during one of his fireside chats on July 28, 1943. And said he and his advisors were laying out plans to return to civilian life of our gallant men and women in the armed services. They took care of the guys. They didn't take care of the women right after the war. That took a little while, 1946. He argued that veterans would be entitled to definitive action to help take care of their special problems. On October 27, 1943, he turned that idea into a concrete proposal, formally asking Congress to enact legislation that would finance 1 year of education or vocational training for all those who served in World War II. The men, not the women. As the GI Bill made its way through the House and Senate committees, the unemployment assistance, education, and training provisions came under fire. Republicans worried that the bill would lead to further expansion of the federal government. But Roosevelt was able to basically get everybody on the same page, and here they are signing the bill. March 24th, the Senate unanimously passed the GI Bill. The House passed its version on May 18th. They reconciled the bills. It went to Roosevelt on June 7th, 1944. He signed off on the bill June 22nd. The bill provided money for college education and loans for GIs wanting to own a home or a business. So your father was a vet, probably got the money from here. Oh, you know, Camp Shanks isn't very far from here, right down Route 303. You know, that was segregated. They had the white section and they had the Negro section. And if Ella Fitzgerald came up to perform, the Negroes could watch Ella Fitzgerald. If Frank Sinatra came up to perform, well, the whites could see Frank Sinatra. It was segregated. This is a short called The Negro Soldier. 1944 documentary film created by the United States Army, produced by Frank Capra. And it was basically followed up with a series called Why We Fight. The Army used the film as propaganda to convince black Americans to enlist in the Army and fight in the war. The Negro Soldier proved to be a breakout film, influencing Army members and civilians of all races. By the way, the Battle of the Bulge was the first desegregated action because Eisenhower ran out of men. He needed Negro soldiers, and he called them up. Some Negroes went on the front line. So that's what happened. Civil rights. Well, there's a war going on, right? But there's also civil rights going on. That is Irene Morgan. Anybody ever hear of Irene Morgan? Well, Irene Morgan is a civil rights pioneer. Before there was Rosa Parks and others, before there was the bus strike in Montgomery, there was a bus strike in Little Rock, Arkansas, 1953, there was Irene Morgan. The case begins on July 16, 1944. Irene Morgan, who had just suffered a miscarriage, boarded a Greyhound bus in Virginia for a 5-hour ride to see her doctor in Maryland. She sat in the colored section. When a young white couple boarded the crowded bus and needed seats, the white driver told Morgan, "Surrender your seat." She refused. And hence the lawsuit, Morgan against Virginia. The driver drove right to jail, where the sheriff's deputy came aboard. He handed Morgan an arrest warrant. She tore it up, tossed it out the window. When one of the officers swore at her, she tried and physically tried to remove her. She kicked him. She would eventually sue. At the end, I'll tell you what happened. This is George Stinney. Ever hear of George Stinney? Well, on March 23rd in South Carolina, 2 white girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, were found dead. They didn't return home. the night before. Police arrested Stinney, who was 14 years old, and his older brother Johnny was about 17. Johnny was released. George was held and charged with murder. His trial, an all-white jury, lasted 1 day, and he was found guilty. He had not been allowed to see his family before the trial, and he was questioned alone without an attorney. During the trial, Stinney's defense offered no cross-examination, didn't call any witnesses, and virtually had no defense. The jury deliberated for 10 minutes, found guilty, sentenced to death. He's a little 14-year-old. He is not a big 14-year-old, as you will hear in a minute. It's all about Jim Crow. He's executed on June 16th. He's so small compared to the adults that the prison staff couldn't fit the electrodes on him. 83 days passed between his arrest and his death, and he became the youngest American ever to be executed. 1944. Buy war bonds. Buy war bonds. There was an unusual baseball game in New York. Benefit war bonds. It's June 26, 1944. The Yankees, the Brooklyn Dodgers, and the New York Giants. Basically, it was a 6-inning game for war bonds. The final score, the Dodgers 5. The Yankees won, Giants nothing. Buying war bonds was a normal pitch. The U.S. government had to come up with a lot of money, and they needed to do it fast to meet the expanding financial demands of the war. And basically, Roosevelt said, okay, we'll increase taxes, we'll borrow, and that will be against the massive amount of war bonds that we hope to sell. Oh, by the way, this is also a banned cartoon. Any bonds today with Bugs Bunny shown at movie theaters. Buy war bonds. Reason why it's banned? He goes into blackface and starts singing like Al Jolson. Sammy, Sammy, instead of Mammy, Sammy, Uncle Sam. Anyway, there are the stars of Warner Brothers at that point, Bugs Bunny, Porky Pig, and Elmer Fudd. Any Bonds Today, written by Irving Berlin, it became the theme song of the Treasury Department's National Defense Savings Program. Rationing. Anybody here remember rationing?
Yes,
Yeah, you do.
I was a little girl.
You were a little girl. That means you only could get one pair of shoes a year.
I don't remember what my mother said, got sugar in the carriage.
Yeah, sugar was a problem.
Yeah.
Sugar was a problem. War Rationing Book 1. Punishments. This is if you tried to play around with
It
this.
wasn't in the carriage, my mother took me in, because we had to walk very far.
Oh.
It wasn't like in the immediate neighborhood, it was really far to get
Oh,
sugar.
to get sugar. You didn't have Meyerhoff the grocer? Punishments ranging from high as 10 years in prison or $10,000 fine, or both, may be imposed under United States statutes for violations thereof arising out of infraction of rationing orders and regulations. If you died, your family better return their rationing book. That's how strict they were back in those days. I had a woman about 6 months ago, I was doing 1945 time, and she was about 95 years old. Yeah, she was married 77 years. And she said, we got married in 1945 and we drove up to Niagara Falls. I said, wait a minute, you had an A card. You could only have X amount of gallons of gas a week. She said, I got them all as gifts for our honeymoon so we could get up to Niagara Falls. We used all the cards. I said, I'm not going to tell anybody, but she could have been in jail for 10 years. But 77 years later. So it's a rationing system. You could, supplies like gasoline, butter, sugar, canned milk were rationed. They were needed for the war effort. The war disrupted trade, limiting the availability of some goods. Indonesia now. The Japanese Imperial Army controlled the Dutch East Indies from March of 42 to September of 45, and that created a shortage of rubber, which obviously impacted American production. And see, he could have gone here and he could have given you sugar. As you could look, he's looking at the stamps, he's looking at what this woman is getting. She's getting pears among other things, and he's giving her what she's entitled to. Americans received their first rationing card in March of 1942. The first war ration card, number 1, was known as the sugar book for one of the commodities Americans could purchase with their ration cards. So you went a while to get sugar. Other ration cards developed as the war progressed. Ration cards included stamps with drawings of airplanes, guns, tanks, aircraft, ears of wheat and fruit, which were used to purchase rationed items. My granddaughter, who's 3, loves this cartoon. It's the Gremlin and Bugs Bunny, and Bugs Bunny is reading about gremlins, and hilarity ensues, and he gets on the plane, and the gremlin is tearing apart the plane. It's about ready to crash, and runs out of gas, about 2 feet from where it crashes. And both of them are just sitting there, and Bugs is eating his carrot, and he says, "You know how it is with these 8 cards." They ran out of gas. The Office of Price Administration rationed automobiles, tires, gasoline, fuel oil, coal, firewood, nylon, silk, shoes. Americans used their ration cards and stamps to take a meager share of household staples, including meat, dairy, coffee, dried fruits, jams, jellies, lard, shortening, and oils. Meat came off the rationing list in 1944. Blackouts. Anybody remember blackouts? You do? What'd you do during a blackout? Nothing.
Nothing. We sat by the window.
You sat by the window, but you
I
weren't.
was about this big. and
You
we
weren't
lived- we
supposed
lived
to
in New
look
York City.
out, but you weren't supposed to look out. Well, if a bomb hits, you'd be hit by glass. This had to be in the winter. It had to be somewhere north or somewhere in the west. It doesn't get light, say, in Seattle, Washington, about till 5:30 in the morning. Blackout, 5 a.m. until dawn, daily. Americans in coastal cities were aware of their vulnerability to air attacks and began ordering practice blackouts long before December 7th, 1941. March 8th, 1941, Seattle became the first major American city to test out its blackout procedures. Is that Rosie the Riveter? Is that Rosie the Riveter?
Yeah,
It's not.
no,
It's not.
she's black.
No, Rosie the River wasn't black. Rosie the River, this is Westinghouse, a poster at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. But